Hi, friends, and welcome to the Story Forge podcast. I'm Lyle Smith, your host, and today is one I was really looking forward to. We're going to take a historical look at the 1918 influenza pandemic and compare and contrast a little bit of what happened then to what's been going on today. They say it was Mark Twain who once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." The trick to that, of course, is knowing enough about the history of a thing to hear and recognize the rhymes. We've all heard the word unprecedented an unprecedented number of times these days as it relates to the COVID-19 crisis and the related economic fallout. It's been tiring and testing, frustrating and frightful. And the only thing we have available to look to for comparison in this experience, at least in modern times, is the 1918 flu pandemic. It struck the world 100 years ago. It was in the middle of a great world war. Medical technology was not what it is today. The U.S. population just crested 100 million, and the world population was 1.9 billion. That's compared to 330 million in America today and 7.5 billion people around the world. It killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, 675,000 in the United States alone. And the trouble is, there's very little documentary evidence available on the subject. There's very little study in the history about it at all. Of course, there are news accounts from the time, but so much is anecdotal, and the data is hard to come by. It was a time before television, a time before radio was in regular use. Newspapers were the main source of information around the world. It was a time before medical professionals were required to keep consistent records the way they are today. Some doctors reported at the time caring for so many people they didn't have time to keep track of such things. For 6 decades after, people in America and around the world basically chose to forget about the influenza epidemic. We often say Americans have short memories, but this was historical amnesia on a global scale. Maybe the tragedy was too much. Maybe what followed was too heavy to bear. The Great Depression, another world war. Compare that to today. I've had friends, educated friends, who seem to be exercising a kind of willful ignorance of the facts. They just don't want to believe that the threat is real. Some people diminish it in their minds. Others embrace conspiracies. Either way, we may be on a road to a similar forgetfulness. In current events, it looks like new cases are going down in places like New York, California, and New Jersey, which is good news. But the hospitals are still pretty full. The news is less conclusive in other parts of the country. Several governors, DeSantis in Florida, Kevin Stitt in Oklahoma, Brian Kemp in Georgia, announced plans to lift restrictions on some businesses in a phase 1 to reopening things. The mayor of Las Vegas, Carolyn Goodman, gave an interview just the other day saying she'd prefer to leave the handling of social distancing and other issues to individual businesses to figure out. She said she'd rather let the market decide, which was concerning. Congress just passed the next phase of emergency funding into the PPP program. That's the payroll protection program that should be helpful to at least some small businesses. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, it seems, has suggested letting some of the hard-hit states and localities go bankrupt rather than help with direct emergency funds. It's a crazy, crazy time. And I thought it was important to look to history for some guidance in how to feel about these things. So I had a chat with Dr. Susan Kent from the University of Colorado, who published a great book on the subject in 2012 called The Global Influenza Pandemic of 1918 and 19. It's a truly global look at what happened, how it affected people and governments and President Wilson, and even the fallout leading into the next World War. It's a great conversation that I hope you enjoy as much as I did. And here we go. The only thing we have to compare
what's going on right now in the modern era anyway is the 1918 flu pandemic, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because nothing's come through, a modern society like this.
Right, that's right.
Um, so, when you have 22 million Americans apply for unemployment in 3 weeks in a row, it's like the economic door gets slammed shut. And what do? You have to look to what's happened before.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you're at the University of Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been there?
26 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Very good. Where are you from?
Massachusetts.
From Massachusetts. Okay.
That's where I grew up and lived until in 1988, I took a job at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
Oh, really? Oh, very good.
Yeah. And then came out here.
So how are things going out there? Are you all as shut down as we are?
I have a feeling that we're a little less shut down, but I don't quite know why I say that, except that I went out yesterday and there were plenty of cars on the road, more than I might have expected, and certainly more than I'd seen maybe a week ago.
Right.
And the difference here is that there's so much open space for people to get out onto.
Right.
They can go into the mountains or just onto the trails, the footpaths that are, along the Front Range. And so there's lots for people to get away to do. And I think they're doing that, though I also think they're doing it very responsibly. I haven't seen on the local media any of these big collections of people, with the exception of the protests the other day, people protesting Polis and the shutdown. And those people were jam-packed right up against one another.
Right, I saw that. I saw the coverage of that, and that always, makes you nervous.
The interesting part was that it prompted a counter demonstration by healthcare workers from the hospitals.
Yeah, I saw that. They were standing right in the drive lanes to try and keep I guess they were doing sort of a driving parade protest. Yeah. And they were standing, it made me think of Tiananmen Square in sort of maybe a slightly less threatening way. Yeah. But it's amazing how people are reacting to this, and we'll get to that. I have a few questions about that. But is school still in session? Are you teaching remotely, or you're all done?
Since the week before spring break. So
okay.
We're still meeting with our students remotely, but we have not had any in-class interactions for over a month now.
Right. How's that been? Has that been tough to adjust to, or?
I have a seminar, and the students are writing a research paper. So we had planned anyway to be only meeting to go over the research papers once a week, and it's been easy. But for my colleagues who have very large classes to meet, I think it's been very much a mixed bag, and the students are expressing real, on the one hand, appreciation for what the faculty are trying to do, but on the other hand, real dissatisfaction with the kind of education they're getting for what they have paid for.
Right. Yeah, I wonder about that, because we haven't heard much about that. My son's in public school. He's been doing online learning for more than a month now.
Yeah.
And honestly, his teacher has been kind of spectacular through all of it, but it's not the same. No. It's different, and it's a lot of getting used to things, and we're much more involved than we used to be, which is not entirely a bad thing. But
trying to balance that with your full-time job is a little bit
tough.
Yeah,
it's tough. It's a challenge. It's true. Well, so that's good. So I'm glad your seminar students are getting along.
Yeah,
because you're kind of used to doing it that way anyway, or some version of that way.
Well, they're seniors, and they're this is their capstone course, so they're doing something that's both familiar to them and I think kind of exciting for them, gratifying for them, that they're producing a big original research paper.
Well, so speaking of your background, I looked you up, and you are the head. You're in addition to being having written about the 1918 flu, you are the head of the religious studies program out there.
It's not my department, but I am an external chair for that.
Oh, very good. Very
Yeah.
good. And you've written extensively on what I saw was sort of modern British history and gender politics and gender studies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the British Empire as well. Yeah.
Very good. Oh, my wife's going to have to read all your stuff. She loves all that
Okay.
stuff. And you have a book, at least in your bio, you have a book coming out this year about gender roles in history or something like that.
Well, it's called Gender: A World History. Yeah.
Gender world history. That's fascinating to me. I can't wait to read about that too.
Yeah.
A thoroughly I don't want to say unexplored, but not explored enough, I think.
Not with this kind of breadth.
So the 1918 flu, it was an avian flu. It was called the Spanish flu, and we can talk about why in a minute. It was apparently a variation of the H1N1 flu.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we only found that out about 15 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So people are still looking into it and still studying.
Back then,
the
certainly
impact of
they
it.
were. Yes.
Very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
The population of the U.S. at the time had just broken 100 million. The worldwide population was 1.9 billion, compared to 320 some million in the U.S. today and 7.5 billion worldwide today. So it's a very different world that we're living in. When there's not a lot of research out there, not a lot of historical record of it, and we'll get into that more in a bit. But the one thing that comes up when you first start looking into it, they'll say that the death toll from the 1918 flu was anywhere from 30 million worldwide to 100 million worldwide.
Yeah, and I think it's up closer to 50 to 100 million.
Okay.
And it may be that we settle somewhere around 60, something like that. But just as today we're so undercounted, it will be impossible to really get to the true number.
Right. Well, and we modern day, we have to remember there was a world war going on at the time.
Indeed.
There was a ton of chaos in addition to the pandemic. So counting all those numbers and assessing, death toll to one particular item versus multiple might be more difficult.
Yeah, but one of the things we'll need to talk about is the role of the war in the spread of this disease.
Absolutely. Well, tell me about that. I mean, well, first, one of the things I've read about also, and it says one of the interesting things about the 1918 flu, the Spanish flu, was that not only did it kill off sort of the weakest among us, the youngest, the oldest, the ill, which is what we keep hearing in the news today, as it is comparable to what we hear today, but it also killed quite a few healthy people.
Yes.
It was a very, very virulent.
That 15 to 45 age cohort got hit extremely hard. And there are a number of graphs you can look at to see how the age distribution played out. But if we start at the very young at the top and drop down to people in their single years up to age 10 or so and 15, then at age 15, that curve starts to climb precipitously again, falls after 45, and then will rise again for the elderly. So what it creates is a W curve, which is very unusual.
Yeah, I would think.
The curve is a U.
Right.
Yeah. And
remember, you hear some stories again of what it was like to experience the flu in those days. And it was, they would talk about that particular flu. You could have it, you could be feeling, moderately fine in the morning and have 107 fever by the evening.
Or you could drop dead in the street, quite literally. It could happen that way.
Really? Wow.
Yes.
That's crazy. That's fascinating. It's fascinating and scary. So how did it travel the world? I mean, we like this one, the COVID-19, we've heard it started in China, and maybe it came from people traveling from China, but then we've also heard a lot of community infection from there, and then from Europe also. But the 1918 flu There's a world war going on.
Yeah.
There's armies traveling
Mm-hmm.
from every end of the earth to the other along particular pathways, and we have this pandemic going on. Well, where did it begin?
Well, so let me break this down, okay, for you. First of all, there are 3 different waves of the flu.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first wave begins in Kansas. It's called the Spanish flu because Spain was one of the few countries in Europe that didn't have a news embargo. So it was neutral and it didn't, or putatively neutral, and didn't have a news blackout. So all the stories about the flu came out of Spain, so it looked to observers as if it had begun there. But in fact, it began in Kansas, outside Fort Riley, Kansas, where there were camps of GIs preparing to go into the war, into Europe for the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it moved from there with those troops to Camp Oglethorpe in Georgia. And then from Georgia north to Boston, where troops would embark to ship off to France.
Mm-hmm.
So that first wave starts in the spring and makes its way across the United States and across the Atlantic Ocean, arrives in France kind of late springish, if you will, and spreads south out of Europe into Africa and east into Asia, largely by virtue of normalized trade routes.
Okay.
But the fact that we're in war, it means we've got an awful lot of those commercial routes being used in order to transport goods and material and people. And then in the summer, well, that strain of flu was fairly mild. It made people sick, certainly, and it had an impact on the German offensive in the spring of 1918.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't kill unusual numbers of people.
Mm-hmm.
The second round of flu, or the second wave of flu, occurred in August when the flu virus mutated and became lethal in the extreme. Now, ordinarily, flu viruses mutate all the time, and they become often very deadly, but they become so deadly that they kill off their hosts and they die out.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the war, because there was a constant replenishing of healthy young bodies to the front lines and back and forth, that lethal flu virus was able to sustain itself and spread all the way around the world, killing, as we've mentioned, just millions and millions and millions of people. Wow. Had those troops not been there, had they not been the source of host for this virus, it's very likely it could not have done that kind of damage because there would not have been hosts available to allow it to reproduce and send itself along.
Right. So they were sort of like oxygen is to fire.
Indeed.
That was what
bringing fresh, healthy bodies into the front lines.
Right.
And then there was a final wave in roughly January and February of 1919. And that one wasn't as lethal as that second wave, but by then the populations of Europe and the world were so devastated that it took a healthy number of people. It's over the space of 6 months. That lethal strain of the flu we're thinking roughly August through the end of the year.
Okay.
And then a brief renewal of it. And so in 6 months,
got it,
perhaps as many as 100 million people died.
That's extraordinary. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. And, part of the problem, in addition to the fuel of the virus that we talked about, there wasn't much of a treatment for it at the time.
No treatment whatsoever.
Yeah.
A few exceptions.
And sort of a misunderstanding of what, what you could treat a virus like this with.
Well, first of all, they didn't know it was a virus. They thought it was a bacterium.
Okay.
And they were treating it as if it were a bacterium. They thought they could create a vaccine based on their successes in the past with bacteria. But it wasn't, obviously. It was a virus, and they had no ability to create any kind of vaccine for it or treatment for it. The one exception to being able to treat this disease seems to have come out of Japan and China, where local herbal remedies, which had fever-reducing properties, and which were readily available to even the poorest of peasants in those lands, seems to have had significant enough an effect to reduce their death rates.
Wow. Well, yeah, and so like the fever was really sort of the killing blow of that particular virus, no?
No, it wasn't actually. It's something that we're seeing today with this COVID-19. What killed people tended to be pneumonia, and that cohort of people, 15 to 45, the most healthy people in the population, died in such great numbers because their immune systems set off what physicians and scientists are now calling cytokine storms. This was an immune reaction that was so powerful that it attacked not just the lungs and gave people pneumonia and they died of that, but also their other organs, their liver, their kidneys, potentially their hearts as well. And we're seeing that very same response today in people in a not of great age or even of a young age, but people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, that same storm of a immune response that is so powerful that it goes after the tissues of the body.
That's interesting. I actually read a piece about that the other day. Dr. Fauci apparently was asked about immune boosting treatments and immune boosting things you can do to, diet or whatever that might boost your immune system. And he chuckled a little bit about it and said, most people don't need their immune system boosted. And if you boost it too much, it can actually have this kind of effect that you're describing, which is sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of how the immune system works.
Exactly.
And still to date, there aren't any real treatments for the COVID-19. We read about ventilators and things like that, but that's just a way of trying to keep people breathing until they get over the virus, right?
Yeah.
One thing that came up when I was reading about this that I thought was kind of curious, and I've read about it in relation to the COVID-19 as well, is mental disorders that come out of people who have survived the virus.
Yes. Often the symptoms that people experience, the mental and psychological experience, symptoms that people experienced were not dissimilar from those of shell shock at the time.
Okay.
Interestingly, here this is a disease of the First World War, and that's where shell shock becomes so prominent. Some people had hallucinations and nightmares, and very often their hallucinations were actually about Germans.
Crazy.
Truly.
So it's it's almost it's a PTSD response, really.
Indeed it is. Yes. Yeah. And of course, our PTSD responses tend to be historically based. So if you're going to have hallucinations, you kind of pick around you.
It's funny. I remember my grandmother, who passed away years ago, but she had memories of the 1918 flu because her grandmother ran a boarding house in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And during the flu, when so much of the city was quarantined or individual houses were quarantined, she would send my grandmother out with buckets of soup or food to take to the porches of the people who couldn't get out to the stores. And for the rest of her life, she was petrified of catching the flu.
Oh my.
Absolutely petrified of it. And I always found that to be kind of weird because I never really understood, again, because there's so little out there about the history of this moment in time, this 6-month period where so many people died.
So there are two things that she may have witnessed quite literally. I mentioned people falling literally down in the streets and dying there. It would not be out of the realm of possibility that she observed that. The other thing, if she saw any of the flu victims who had the cyanosis in their faces, which turned their skin blue, a bright
Really?
Blue that was very startling and very frightening. If she saw that, I can imagine that she didn't, that image didn't go away for the rest of her life.
Wow. That's, well,
Yeah.
that's frightening. You know, it's interesting because I I don't remember learning anything about this really in school, you know.
No, you didn't.
I remember hearing about it from my grandmother and all that sort of thing. But back in 2000, I think it was PBS did a documentary where they interviewed all these centenarians, all these 100-year-old people about their experience of the 20th century. And they talked about the first time they saw a car and the first time, you know, man landed on the moon, the first time they saw a calculator and all kinds of crazy things. And they all answered these things in different ways and had different memories of everything. But in one of the episodes, they got to a point where they started talking about the 1918 flu. And all of a sudden, all of them had almost exactly the same recollection of what happened. And they were all, and it was just pure, they were petrified. They were absolutely petrified of it. And and almost every single one of them used the same phrase. They talked about, because so many people died so quickly, they couldn't get ahead of the graves to dig all the graves in time. They would talk about the bodies being piled up like cordwood.
Oh.
And that's what got me. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've never, and never once have I really heard about this in my American history books.
Yeah, no, you haven't. Because again, as I say, and we'll talk about that, this collective refusal to remember it.
Right. I mean, that's interesting. There's I picked up a historical amnesia from one of your interviews, which is just fascinating. You know, we always say Americans have a short memory for things, and this is worldwide, of course. But you know, maybe we really do. I mean, this is 100 million, maybe 100 million.
Not just a short memory; it's no memory until the AIDS epidemic, HIV epidemic, started to, I think, stimulate some of that research. At any rate, I found some of these quotes. If you want me to read some of them, okay. This is from a writer in Britain. Her name is Carolyn Plain, and she talked about what she called the plague of nervous character that followed the onslaught of influenza. Pronounced fatigue, lassitude, depression, sleeplessness, hallucinations, emotional lability, and even dissociation is what she and physicians very often noted in their patients. One guy writes in the British Medical Journal that mental symptoms were frequent. The depression which follows influenza is so constant that it ought to be regarded as part of the disease.
Wow.
Yeah. And then another, the medical correspondent for the Times, the most distressing symptom was a swift loss of mental capacity and then inability to think coherently.
Wow.
One guy talks about hysteria after influenza, which is in fact PTSD. And so it goes on and on. The higher centers of the nervous system suffer chiefly, said one physician. Marked depression is common, emotional instability is often seen, and suicide is by no means rare.
And we're living in a time now where sort of depression and dissociative issues and suicide, especially among veterans, has been climbing at an alarming rate already.
Yeah.
Before all this happened. Yeah. So these are real things. And President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, apparently had the flu during the Paris agreements, which impacted his ability to negotiate. Correct?
Yes, indeed. In fact, one of the cases I would make in this little book is that prior to being struck down with the flu, he was holding his own against Clemenceau and Lloyd George as they were negotiating this peace and saying we must have a just peace and a peace with honor that will allow Germany to recover. Then he gets the flu and he's really deathly ill, also suffering hallucinations and these kind of mental disorders that have been reported. His physician is there in describing some of this. His Secret Service detail is there describing some of this stuff. when he is well enough to go back to negotiations, he folds completely, and no longer is in any kind of emotional or physical position to stand up to Clemenceau and Lord George. And what is the result is this Versailles Treaty that is so very punitive and so very implicated in the rise of fascism that will occur some 10 years later.
Well, sure. Well, famously, Hitler's early speeches were all about, the fatherland and being oppressed by, foreign entities and stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's you can draw a pretty straight line from one to the next. And Wilson was interesting because Wilson, I know he had diminishing mental issues through his presidency, and then to the point where his wife was basically running the White House at one point.
He had a series of strokes when he came back from Paris.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which you have to think, could, given his age and health, may have been related in some way.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, and I would not doubt that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this was going on all in the midst of the war, in the trenches, on the front, and home, wherever, on all around, home being all around the world in civilian areas. How were people reacting to it? I mean, how did they treat, like, soldiers, for example, from the front? How would they treat the flu at the front?
Again, there was little they could do, and seemingly the best treatment was nursing care, which is to say, again, treating the fever, trying to keep it down, trying to keep fluids in.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, again, we have this breakdown of 80-20 that we see in the COVID virus, that of the people who contracted the virus, 80% of them got sick and recovered.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 20% who didn't recover that fared so badly, obviously. And we see that today. So that things that tended to enable people to get well was nursing care rather than any kind of medical intervention, because there simply was nothing that could be done.
Right. So, I mean, anything to keep the fever down, because they had extremely high fevers in this thing.
Yeah.
I know that. And to keep them from getting it permanently into the lungs. And how about on the home front, say?
Well, there are all kinds of quack remedies, and so people who were selling patent medicines in their stores actually ended up doing quite well because they had a steady clientele. There were all kinds of stories in the newspaper about what you should try to make it work, and it included things like cinnamon and cloves and arsenic and all kinds of then deadly treatments. They just threw stuff out there as possible interventions, none of which could work.
Well, it's like the plague masks, right? They wore those plague masks that looked like bird beaks that were filled with all sorts of scented things, because they thought the scent was how it was carried into your lungs. And then, but today we have people. There's one I read from the 1918 era where they talked about sugar cubes soaked in kerosene.
Yes, indeed.
Which is just insane.
I know.
But we have people today who are talking about drinking, bleach. And today we see a fair number of people. There's an, like you say, in and around Boulder. There's people who are doing the right thing. They're going, even though they're going outside, getting fresh air and getting the sunshine, they're still observing the social distancing and doing the right thing. But there's at least a fair number who are not, or are ignoring it, or are just outright not believing it and believing it's something else. Was that something that was going on too?
I think it was, it started out that way. And so places like Philadelphia, for instance, refused to put in place the kinds of bans that other cities and towns put in place. So they banned theater going or other mass areas. They did not, however, ban bars or churches. So that it continued to spread. But Philadelphia refused to do any of that closing down, and they took an enormous hit in casualties.
Right.
But as this thing moved along into the fall, I mean, the numbers were simply inescapable.
Right. And you can't ignore it. Yeah.
675,000 people died.
Oh, that's
So,
amazing. So now we're seeing a pretty hard push to get back to normal, right? To reopen the economy and all that sort of thing. And even though there's lots of places that haven't, and flattening the curve is kind of I don't want to say it's a misnomer. Flattening the curve is about slowing the number of people going into the hospitals.
right.
It's not about eradicating the virus. It's about, being able to manage the sick people. Which has been really good in a lot of places, but there's a lot of places it hasn't quite flattened yet, and yet they're still talking about trying to get the economy up and running again, which clearly is important. But how does that compare to what was going on 100 years ago?
Well, when the war ended, that second lethal wave died out, and that's because the hosts were in effect gone, right? The war's over and people are out of the trenches, and that continuous introduction of new healthy bodies to keep the virus alive stops. But then it comes back in January and February. And
right.
It's a different strain. It's not nearly as lethal. And it lasts roughly 2 months.
Okay.
Which is not unusual for, I think, a flu period of whatever it might be, incubation and virility. There would have been cases of this flu into 1920, but not an epidemic anywhere and not a pandemic anywhere, certainly.
Okay.
Just individual cases of H1N1 that carried over into 1920 occasionally.
Right. So basically the what happens with these viruses is they reach a level of a level in the population that either encourages or forces it to mutate, or herd immunity through vaccinations when a vaccine becomes available, and it tends to mutate and kind of disappear, right?
Unless it has a fresh source of hosts, it will disappear. It'll be too deadly it kills its host too quickly,
right,
for it to reproduce.
How did the governments of the time deal with it, if they did at all, in a policy way, and then afterwards how?
So the United States had local public health agencies and facilities that would have responded on a state-by-state basis. But it didn't, I believe, and again, I may not be right about this because this is not my area.
Sure.
I don't believe it had a national one.
Right.
Certainly Britain had no public health service at all, and the flu brought about the creation of that. Also in South Africa, the situation of the flu helped create a public health service, but at the same time, it also helped to further segregation, which had already begun in places like Johannesburg and Pretoria and the Cape, but enabled the expansion of segregated areas, black and white. So on the one hand, you've got this positive result if you're a Western scientific thinking person in a public health agency being created.
Right.
On the other hand, it helped to enhance segregation, and ultimately that would lead to apartheid. So it have its positive and negatives.
Yeah. History's a funny thing that way. I mean, the way people react to, they react in their time, right? In the way they think in their time. So, the idea of, all people being equally risky for a health crisis may not have been part of the thinking in those days.
Well, and certainly indigenous folks got hit extremely hard in this country, in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand. They really took it on the chin in far, far greater numbers than Anglo-Americans, for instance, or white Australians or New Zealanders.
Wow. And now, again, just to compare to now, we're living in a time where people are, and I don't think it's the majority by any stretch, but there are substantial numbers or significant numbers of people who kind of fight against the authority of science, fight against the authority of, what these health services are telling us to do. Which is, I read somewhere that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. At best, it's kind of a blip in the historical record, for most people anyway, the 1918 flu, until now, when we have something to compare it to that we feel every day. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, again, for about 60 years following the end of the outbreak in 1919, we did not have any kind of conscious historical memory of this event. And it wasn't until the late 1970s that Alfred Crosby wrote one of the first treatments of the 1918 flu pandemic. My argument is that, well, it's twofold. And the most straightforward and simplest way to think about this would be to suggest that what follows 1919 in world history is so immense. The Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the Second World War, the Cold War, that there isn't room for the flu to, in effect, be remembered, that it's upstaged by all those extraordinarily dramatic and consequential events. But the other piece of it, I am almost certain, though it's unprovable, is that the traumas created by this flu event, in the context of the traumas created by the Great War itself, made it much easier just not to think about them, to move on and along, rather than try and entertain what this might have meant for society, for this society, for British society, for the French or the Germans or whatever it might have been. Right. That it is truly a response to a trauma that induces a kind of historical amnesia. Again, in the context of these other very huge and traumatizing in their own right events and instances that follow.
Right. So it really is part of that lost generation, right? I mean, that's truly what it is. I mean, it not only is it a lost generation of, people, young people killed in a world war, but it's sort of a willful forgetting of an event, just to survive and move on.
Because so many more people died of the flu than in combat. So how do you take that in? Really?
That's incredible, right? I mean, it's really an incredible statistic just by itself.
Yeah.
And, history's funny that way. I mean, I remember, all these little events that weren't little at the time, they seem like little tidbits that get forgotten in the greater story of things, like the Battle of Yorktown, for example, was won by the Americans largely because there was an enormous hurricane that hit at that same time, or the day before, and it kept the British out at sea just a little bit longer.
And the British were there too with their navy, so they played a part as well.
Right, and it's one of those things that didn't really make most of the history books.
Right, exactly.
For whatever reason, so history
celebrate Yorktown as a great victory. It was an error.
it was a little bit of a strike, a lucky strike right there.
Yes, exactly.
It really was.
Exactly.
And for better or worse, and history is. I remember reading a book years ago called How the Irish Saved Civilization, by Thomas Cahill. And I remember reading it and loving it and telling people the title, and they all kind of said, like, oh yeah, he's just bragging that the Irish did. And it's like, but if you read the book, that's not really what it's about at all. It just happens to be, they happen to be at that spot in that time, and they happen to have the books, and they saved the books from being burned. And he makes no judgment that was a good thing or a bad thing. It was just a thing. So history's really fascinating that way. It's filled with those little things.
Bunch of accidents.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. All right.
I'm lucky to be able to do what I do.
I'm jealous of it.
Yeah.
I have to say, it's really, to be that in depth with these things is really, really fascinating. So, thank you so much for your time. I have had such a good time talking to you.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this tremendously.
Very good.
So that was Dr. Susan Kent from the University of Colorado, and a discussion of, well, the more things change, the more they sometimes seem to stay the same. History is an important thing to look to when we're trying to understand things that are going on around us today. So stay healthy out there, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
If you find yourself enjoying the StoryForge podcast, please give us a review at Apple Podcasts, or we're on Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps others find the show and hopefully enjoy it as much as you do. All recording, editing, and executive producing tasks are handled by yours truly, Lyle Smith of Nimblesmith, the content marketing agency. This podcast would not be possible without the sincerely excellent help of our friend and associate producer Anthony Sergi, who produces numerous podcasts, including the truly excellent A Guest in the House about all things hip-hop. The music on the podcast was provided by Jody Nardone and the Jody Nardone Trio, Lights Will Guide You Home album. And if you'd like to send us questions or feedback or suggestions for other subjects or guests, you can reach us through the StoryForge website. That's thestoryforge.com, all words separated by hyphens. Or you can email us at cheers@nimblesmith.com, spelled NymbleSmith. Thanks very much.